Thanks for inviting me to speak today about this particular topic, cyber conflict and ICT security in the ASEAN region. And I think it's a nice kind of flow from the first presentation, because when I take my perspective, and I'll say a bit more about my perspective, there are probably lots of things in common between, well, let's say, how we perceive current challenges and current solutions, and then I'm talking from an Australian perspective, and that from Singapore, but then predominantly the Singaporean government. So maybe a few words about ASPI. I've been asked that quite a number of times. So we are the Australian Strategic Policy Institute based in Canberra. It's a think tank. So maybe a bit similar to New Narrative. We do research, but we're also very active in kind of the policy debate and in the media to kind of create a common understanding for everyone about what's happening in particular around cyber policy, but also to be able to inform government as well as to review and sometimes criticize government in terms of what they're doing or how transparent they are towards the public. So what I would like to talk about is more an international relations perspective. Talk about what's happening in, let's say, the entire region, and try to see kind of what I believe are great concerns, which may be unaddressed thus far. And maybe I'd like to ask a question to you as the audience. Now that you're sitting here and you look at the region, based on your own experience, how would you currently assess, let's say, the international climate when it comes to cybersecurity or ICT security? Do you think it's peaceful? Do you think it's pretty contentious? Or is it a bit of a mixed hybrid situation, where the political situation is tense, but still we can find, let's say, common agreements to address certain problems? Or are we in a bit of a pre-crisis stage? Or are we actually in a rat crisis stage? Things are at the brink of getting really nasty. Who's leaning towards red? No? Who's leaning towards light blue? No? Everyone's a little bit in the middle?
Yeah.
Alright. I'm sharing with you a quote. I'll just read it out for a moment. So this is a quote from a report produced, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, in 2015 by a UN group of governmental experts. And they recognized, studying existing and potential threats to international peace and security from an ICT perspective, they said there are disturbing trends in the global ICT environment, including a dramatic increase, and this is diplomatic language, so if they say dramatic increase, it's really dramatic. It's a dramatic increase in incidents involving the malicious use of ICTs by state and non-state actors. So actually states are recognizing that states are at the origin of malicious incidents in the ICT space. And they say these trends create risks for all states, and the misuse of ICTs may harm international peace and security. And that's kind of an alarming bell, right? So if it says there is a risk to international peace and security, that's a raise or flag something to be of real serious concern. And then there is the second bullet saying a number of states are developing capabilities for military purposes, and the use of ICTs in future conflict between states is becoming more likely. Now this report, the recommendations were in 2015, so that's a good 4 years ago, agreed and endorsed by all 193 member states of the United Nations. So all governments in the world said, we're happy with this report, we don't have any objections to it, this is indeed how we see the current situation. Now maybe going back a little bit, because terminology is so important and can also be so kind of putting things in the wrong perspective. When I talk about kind of cyber conflict, I try to perceive it in a certain way, which is not a formal definition, I don't think it exists. But if I'm talking about cyber conflict, I'm talking about kind of ICT incidents that are or have been kind of a concern of national security. an incident that may have led for a crisis cabinet meeting saying what the X is happening, do we have to do something about this? These are also operations which I think are politically motivated by other states with the aim of manipulating, denying, disrupting, degrading or destroying information systems in another country. And one conclusion, one observation we have been able to draw thus far is that there have been no cases of armed conflict or the use of armed force in the legal sense of the word. All of the operations that we've seen fall, as they say, below the threshold of armed conflict and use of force, which means that kind of the normal ways how we deal with international conflicts through the United Nations, through regional forums like ASEAN or the ASEAN Regional Forum have not yet been, let's say, practiced. That doesn't mean that there is no evidence of things happening. And I just show you, this is it's called the Cyber Operations Tracker, which has been compiled by the Council of Foreign Relations in the US, which says there are about 20 to 30 states globally at the moment which are developing military capabilities to conduct cyber operations. And they found to list all kinds of incidents or operations of where there is, let's say, a public recognition. And you see this list goes on and on and on and on. So what I've done, this is a global list, I've tried to see which ones actually affecting the states in the ASEAN region. And this is not an exhaustive list. The actual list is at least twice as long. I think there are a few conclusions you can draw here, is that it already started way back, at least 10 years ago. Prior to that, we don't really have a public recollection. It affects all ASEAN member states, whether as a direct target or victim of an operation or just facing the fallout of operations happening on the other side of the planet. So you see here maybe the first one, which you might have heard in the news, where one of the senior officials from the National Election Committee in Indonesia, he alleged that there was an attempt to tamper with the electoral database, and it would lead to IP addresses. So that's kind of the first identification number, IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses from Russia and China. Doesn't mean that it came from Russia or China, or that it went to Russian or Chinese state, but at least that they've used Russian and Chinese infrastructure to try to tamper with the Indonesian voter database. One, I think, well-published main factor was, for instance, the data breach in Singapore in 2018, where the details of the Prime Minister were stolen for his private medical details. So, it just gives you an idea of, let's say, what's happening. And you see that all ASEAN member states are definitely kind of involved and implicated in one way or the other. But that's ASEAN on the receiving end. What's the situation in ASEAN kind of on the other end? And I've tried to look at, let's say, which states in the region have an acknowledged role, a military role in cyberspace. And this is coming from a report that our institute published in 2017. And you see here Australia and the 10 ASEAN member states, and you see that a few of those have declared military capabilities. So I'm talking about Singapore, Malaysia, I think those are the two main ones. But the bulk of them are suspected to have certain capabilities, but we don't know. And it's definitely not declared. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's ASEAN kind of in the center, on the receiving end, in terms of their military capabilities. But then again, there is, let's say, ASEAN's outer ring. And here you see a list of so-called APTs, advanced, I lost the phrase, but kind of these are kind of organized advanced persistent threat actors, kind of hacking groups, sponsored by nation states who have been active in the region. And you see, maybe not in the back, but definitely here in front, you can read, let's say, the suspected, and in most cases, confirmed states sponsoring activities. So you see North Korea, China, Vietnam, Russia, but definitely also kind of the United States and France and other kind of very cyber mature nations. Do they immediately impact ASEAN? Maybe not, but their activities in the region do create instability in the trust and confidence of the network. I think that's important to consider also with the other breakout group session. How do we ensure that the network is trusted by each and everyone in order to enable social and economic growth? So what's the so what here? I believe military capabilities are not a problem per se. It's every state has the right to develop military or police or intelligence capabilities. You can't disagree with that. But what is problematic is that we don't know about the strategic intent of most states in the region. We have undeclared capabilities, which creates unprediction and uncertainty. And we have a sheer lack of doctrine. So we don't know by which rules or guidelines operations of states are guided. With that in mind, with also in mind that irrevocably any act in cyberspace has transboundary effects. So even though I want to do something domestically, you cannot prevent something from crossing into another state's jurisdiction, which could eventually lead to some kind of tensions regionally or internationally. The other side of the coin is so what? So nations in ASEAN will be increasingly affected. That's what I obviously already said. And I think there are two problems here. One is the overall level of cyber maturity, which is not too high, but also the ability to deal with fallouts happening elsewhere. There are a few states in the region with very advanced capabilities. I don't want to mention Singapore again, but Singapore is obviously, let's say, one of the top cyber mature nations because of their abilities. So that's a concern, and that's a concern generally for the stability of cyberspace. And there's also the call for capacity building. That's what all of the ASEAN member states have been calling for. We need more capacity building in order to lift up our maturity. But there is a dilemma, a typical security dilemma for anyone who studied international relations. Because if I can increase the defensive or military capabilities of another state, how do I know that they are not going to use it against me? And then there is a capacity building aspect. Is if I'm happy to support you, but how do I know, how can I be assured that you are not using it for what I consider illegitimate purposes? So it becomes, let's say, high politics. And then there is another thing I would like to flag here, is that the ASEAN member states, this is nothing new, but thus far we have managed to kind of, and when I say we, the international community have managed to work to agree to what ASEAN calls, in principle, commitments to international law, international norms and rules, and confidence building measures. And I think the in principle is very crucial here, because for anyone who's slightly aware of diplomatic language, that could mean literally anything, from I am really, let's say, supportive of this, or yeah, well, I don't object to it. Right? And this is actually the ASEAN ministerial statement, which calls for these in principle agreement or subscription to 11 voluntary non-binding norms, which, and maybe that's the counter argument to let's say the first presentation, which actually Singapore has been driving very intensely. So they really take a leadership role there for the region. Last slide. So what number two, that's the continuation. The other element I would like to flag here is the behaviour of cyber powers outside of ASEAN. And I had to think of, does anyone know Fawlty Towers? Famous UK, is a British comedy where John Cleese at some point says, don't mention the war. We all know that certain states outside of ASEAN are doing operations here in Australia, but also in the region, but we don't dare to call them out for all kinds of reasons. Either our technical abilities to be 100% sure, but also the political considerations of not willing to impact the relationship with outside powers. That's what I had to share. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And if you have any kind of feedback or comments, please feel free